author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we'll be discussing VP Harris's VP choice, why Wall Street is panicking, and the Tinderbox Middle East. It's going to be quite the show. With Minnesota Governor Tim Walz on the Democratic ticket alongside Kamala Harris, what does this mean for the Democratic Party? And is it a big win for Harris herself? Well, to figure all this out, we're joined by Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, I think that, like many of us, you were quite surprised that she opted for Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, because it's really, as far as I can tell, it was the worst possible choice electorally for her when you consider the Electoral College and that she's fighting for the 2024 campaign.
Well, I think that she, in the end, just wasn't willing to take the risk of adding a Jewish man to the ticket at a time where the pro-Hamas crowd is basically stealing most of the headlines regarding the left. She just didn't quite get past the idea that he's pro-fracking, that he's pro-Israel, on top of the fact of being Jewish. And of course, it raises the question of whether it was rank anti-Semitism, which is just spreading through the Democratic Party like a virus, whether that was the reason. But for whatever reason, she didn't pick Josh Shapiro. But what was the most shocking to me is that, Walz may have been sixth on a six-person list maybe a week or even a few days ago. So I didn't know that much about him. But one thing I did know is that Kamala Harris is the biggest stain on her record, really, is her support of the rioters in Minneapolis after the 2020 George Floyd episode. And at the time, it seemed like a good idea. She raised money to release violent criminals who had helped to burn down the city of Minneapolis. Turns out, as the governor of Minnesota, that Tim Walz did nothing for 3 days as the capital of his state burned. So you'd think that the last thing that Kamala Harris would want to do is to revisit the summer of 2020, which now, of course, takes on an entirely different context now that we know that Black Lives Matter is what it is, a Marxist organization looking to tear down the entire system of government. So what this does now is doesn't give her credentials in the center at all. She has eschewed a moderate option and gone full on hard left. And it's hard to imagine what she was thinking other than the fact that she just didn't have quite the courage to pick someone who would have definitely improved the ticket, certainly would have given her a good chance to win Pennsylvania, which is the most critical state in the country. But instead, she chose to pick someone who's entirely associated with arguably the worst episode of her career. I mean, and you look at the statements, Mark, I'll just use two of them. The candidate himself, Tim Walz, said one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. I think that tells you everything you need to know. But what was even worse, Mark, was what his wife said. His wife, while the city was burning, while a police station had been set on fire and torched, she said she opened the window so she could smell the burning rubber on tires, so that she could memorialize this moment for its significance, essentially, in American history. that is absolutely shocking that she would say something like that. It was good, essentially, is what she was saying, that this whole riot came to pass.
Well,
days and days of rioting that, by the way, destroyed dozens of Black-owned businesses.
Tim, that I don't want to assign motivation to anybody, but in terms of it being seen as being a good thing that was happening, well, I would argue perhaps that got rid of Donald Trump. It was those riots, that unrest that was
on top of
permitted.
COVID.
Yeah, on top of COVID, of course, the unrest that was permitted, especially, of course, as you say, in Minneapolis, to run unfettered, that sparked similar protests across the country and indeed the world, which was an integral ingredient in defeating Donald Trump in the 2020 election. So I suppose from somebody who is wedded to the political career there, it probably was a good thing for her. But let's say, so we've discounted, well, sorry, we've not discounted, we've discussed why she possibly didn't go for Josh Shapiro. And I do want to delve into that a bit later, because I think that could be one of the most significant issues of the election.
Mm-hmm.
But she also didn't choose Mark Kelly, which Mark Kelly's an astronaut. I mean, that's basically rock star status, right?
He's an astronaut, and he's married to a woman who, like Donald Trump, was a victim of an assassination attempt. Gabby Giffords.
Gabby Giffords.
I mean,
pop that in there, Tim.
But he did not meet the ideological purity test of the far left, because he has at times been critical of the Biden-Harris immigration policies. So the left also tore Mark Kelly down, just like they tore down Josh Shapiro.
We should point out
they called him genocide Josh.
Yeah.
And Kamala Harris responded and said, okay, I won't take him then. I'd rather lose the election than take someone that might stir up even more unrest on the far left. And especially at the convention in a couple of weeks, the last thing that Kamala Harris needs is an already probably out of control series of demonstrations and protests that would only get larger and more explosive if she picked Josh Shapiro. I mean, there's just no question. And look, another thing is, and John Fetterman, who is a lot of things, but one of them is starkly honest for a politician. He said that he thought that Kamala Harris didn't pick Josh Shapiro because he would outshine her, and that Walz wouldn't. Walz is a guy that told Kamala Harris, look, I'm at the very end of my career. And I think that's a good pick then, in the sense that this guy's got nothing to lose. He can say anything, do anything, and maybe that's a good thing, but it may well be a bad thing.
We're going to pick this conversation up after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing the conversation with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Tim Donner. Now, Tim, we've just been talking about Tim Walz and how he's essentially a man with nothing to lose politically. He's at the end of his political career. There's a good chance that, especially after having the prospect of Joe Biden and Donald Trump fighting it out for the White House again, that an older white man is unlikely to be topping a ticket anytime soon. So this is a good chance for him to get some glory. But what does he bring to the Harris ticket electorally? Because he's from Minnesota. Minnesota, Joe Biden won that 7 points in 2020.
Yeah, it's not a swing state. So he doesn't get you a swing state. He doesn't get you moderate Democrats. and people in the middle and left-leaning independents or centrist independents. He doesn't give you anything in the South. He's not going to help in Georgia or Arizona or North Carolina or Nevada. He might have been of some use in the upper Midwest, except for the fact that Donald Trump already has the quintessential heartland success, rags to riches story in J.D. Vance. He's nothing if not the quintessential heartlander. So I don't see any advantage in picking Walz for that reason either. And this begs the question of what he does bring to the ticket. Generally speaking, and it's always been a successful strategy, not that every candidate that's followed it has won, but you try to balance off your weaknesses and vulnerabilities when you pick a vice presidential candidate. As I said on LibertyNation.com, that was the only thing conventional about Donald Trump in 2016 was that he picked a man in Mike Pence who gave him cover with conservatives and Christians. Barack Obama picked Joe Biden because he needed street cred with the DC establishment. So did Ronald Reagan when he picked George H.W. Bush. These things are always done, even with wildly unsuccessful candidates like Michael Dukakis, who understood that as a Northeast liberal in 1988, he definitely needed to soften that image, and he picked a conservative Democrat from Texas, Lloyd Bentsen, to be his running mate. But I don't see a single advantage to picking Tim Walz, as hard as I try, except possibly for the fact that by balancing off a woman of color with a white man in a
that's very surface level, isn't it?
In a time of identity politics, maybe that means something, but I think it's an extremely weak choice. Just looking objectively at it, had probably 5 other candidates on his list of 6 that would have helped a lot more than Tim Walz, and certainly wouldn't have relitigated the 2020 summer in Minneapolis, which Kamala Harris already had a lot of explaining to do about, and now partnering with a man who stood by and did nothing as his capital city burned and his wife opened the window to enjoy the smell of burning tires. It's incomprehensible to me, but I think that she figures it's just the safest choice for the far left because they're the loudest voices in the room.
I think that's the key there, Tim. I reckon you've hit the nail on the head. It's essentially ideologically cemented the progressive left as the de facto power voice in the Democratic Party stable.
No question.
So you've got Kamala Harris, who, according to the now deleted records that were kept on her thing, she was the most liberal senator for at least one of the years she was in the Senate. And you've got
Bernie Sanders apparently was pretty upset because he
wanted to be the most
one year. Yeah, he only finished second behind Kamala.
So you've got that, and then you've got Tim Walz, who driver's licenses for illegal immigrants. You've got,
this guy, the first thing he did,
felons.
The first executive order he signed was to form a council on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know that he did nothing during the riots. He supported defunding the police. He cut the Minneapolis police force by 40%. He has his own carbon-free agenda. He has ordered that Minnesota become carbon-free by 2040. He wants convicted felons to be able to vote. He wants illegal aliens to receive free health care, free college. It's a full laundry list of progressive policies.
Absolutely. Now, here's something I want you to consider, Tim. We've seen this week Cori Bush, squad member in the House, Missouri, Scott
Yes.
and she lost her primary challenge, her primary contest to win a third term in the House, following in the footsteps of Jamal Bowman of New York, who won in the small district of the Bronx, but in the larger, was it Westchester, he lost pretty much everything. So he's out. You've got Cory Bush out. The squad of five is now 40% down, or will be 40% down at least come the next Congress. And what this tells me is that people who, because it's Democrats who are voting in these primaries, what this signifies to me, maybe not tells me, but signifies to me, is that Democrat Party, the voters at large, are not in with both feet to this anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, which
Certainly
is tangentially pro-Hamas.
Certainly not.
And they're not into it. And so, and they're willing to cast a vote for people who are not pushing that particular agenda. So that makes me wonder
now,
what a bad decision this might be for Kamala Harris.
It leaves voters with no choice. In other words, you either vote progressive or you vote conservative.
Or you stay home.
If he had picked someone who would serve as a moderating influence on her governance, there'd kind of be something for everyone, including people in the middle, looking for an alternative to Donald Trump. But that's out the window now because, look, they tried to target the Nikki Haley voters, did the Kamala Harris campaign just like Joe Biden did. But Nikki Haley came out yesterday and said, or what she actually said was a win for open borders socialism and Iran. That doesn't sound like a woman who is approving of the candidate who is being sort of lifted up in her name as a moderate alternative to Donald Trump. She's off the map now, and that's a crucial coalition that they're going to miss is the Haley voters.
Let's talk about another coalition very briefly, Tim. Last question for you. If Kamala Harris and Tim Walz win the presidency in November, they'll be looking at the talent pool within the Democratic Party, and that's a very deep bench. There's a lot of talent in that bench. There's a lot of people to choose from. Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, even Pete Buttigieg to some degree. But all of these people who may have had aspirations for a higher office, they now have to wait 8 years. And that essentially means, as far as I can tell, that's that if Kamala Harris wins, of course, that means that their political hopes are over because Kamala Harris has gotten the top spot without a primary. And now many of these people might have challenged if there was an open primary against Kamala Harris. So how much goodwill do you think she's going to have going into a presidency if she wins?
Well, I'll tell you what was remarkable about her rollout was that it was in Philadelphia. And so everybody assumed it would be Josh Shapiro as her pick. He came out. He delivered a beautiful stemwinder. He had everybody on their feet, and it just reminded everybody again what might have been, while lifting Josh Shapiro to perhaps near front-running status for 2028.
And that's a good time to wrap it up. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Has the American dream turned into a dystopian nightmare for first-time home buyers? Well, that's the question that we're going to address today when we're joined by Liberty Nation's economics editor, Mr. Andrew Moran. How are you, Andrew?
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. We're glad to have you on here. Hopefully you're not going to bring us too much doom, and there might be some bright silver linings or gold-backed or gilt-edged or Dogecoin linings on those rainy clouds. But let's talk about the housing market, Andrew. Am I correct in thinking, and I presume I am, that there are now 200 plus cities where a starter home will cost you $1 million?
Yes, that is correct. That is according to new findings from real estate data firm Zillow. So about 237 cities have starter homes of at least $1 million. Now, our grandparents would have just been baffled by this, but When it comes to Federal Reserve intervention, years of underbuilding, and inflation, this is the current state of the U.S. housing market.
I mean, how does anybody expect somebody to get one? I mean, sure, it's 200, I think you said 237 cities. There are a lot of cities in the US, I get it. So this is still the minority position, but it does indicate a trend that more cities will be falling into this, what should we call it? Ignominious award of it's $1 million for a starter home. But a starter home is by its nature small or smaller, and it's something that people want to move into to get a foot on the property ladder. That's the very definition of a starter home. So are these becoming homes for, I don't know, more people getting closer to middle age because they've managed to save up enough that they can afford a mortgage on that? Is that what's happening? So you got people living in basements, and then you tell me.
Well, I mean, there's a plethora of factors of why these current things are happening. So when it comes to starter homes, they're typically existing homes, homes that were built 30 years ago. But if I bought, you look at this, so it's two things. If you look at the sales activity of existing homes, it's crashed to a screeching halt. Nobody's selling them anymore. Now, this leads to the second factor. Why is that? So this all dates back to 2020 when the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to nearly zero, mortgage rates cratered to below 3%. If I'm either a first-time home buyer, I looked at a starter home, I took advantage of the cheap prices, and I took advantage of that historically low 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. If I'm a current homeowner, I'm not going to sell. Why would I sell when I'm going to pay double the mortgage rate, or I'm going to pay higher prices for these homes? So these people are not leaving whatsoever. It's called the golden effect. I think that's what it's called, because I'm sitting on a high valued property at a low rate. I'm not going to pay double the monthly mortgage payments on this property, so I leave, and that is one of the causes of today's sky high housing market.
So really, you wrote about this in a fantastic article on the page of LibertyNation.com, sponsor of today's show, and you discussed how the idea of the home with the white picket fence, a yard out the back, barbecue out there. Although in your case, and I hope I'm not breaking a confidence here, it would be tofu burgers for some reason.
I'm not a fan of tofu burgers. I like the pea protein burger.
The pea protein burger. I'll never eat again, Andrew. You've put me up. Well, actually, I'll probably have something later. But so this dream of having a backdoor barbecue for a young family in a multitude of cities across the United States, it's just getting further out of reach, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's Redfin who crunches the data on this, and it shows you need to make at least six figures in order to own a property in the United States today, because the median housing prices are between $300,000 and $450,000. Now, what typical person or typical household can afford that? It's impossible. And then you have
Sorry, Andrew. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to really drill into that, because that's crazy town talk, isn't it? You've got the average home price between $350,000, $450,000. That's the average home price. Median home price. Sorry. So you need median, mean. I've got to get those correct in my head. It's been a few years. So you need $100,000 a year to be able to afford the upkeep on that, to afford the payments on that. Now, what is the average?
Well, that's just to qualify. That's just to qualify.
Sure. What is the median wage in the United States?
Well, $65,000 a year.
So we're seeing the issue here, aren't we?
Exactly. Huge gap.
The median price of a house, $100,000. The median price, the median wage, $65,000. So either you have to have two people who are doing at least averagely well come together to put every penny they have into getting a house that they may not be able to afford if there's an issue with interest rates further down the line, or houses are going to be bought up by large companies and then rented out at exorbitant fees, which means that these people aren't going to save money anyway in order to afford a deposit on a house.
Yeah, there's a funny meme. It's that old or elderly gentleman holding a cup of coffee, and he says, "Oh, the bank denied me to have a mortgage of $1,500 a month, so I'm going to pay $2,500 a month in rent." So
right.
Today's financial system, it's I feel sorry for the young generation because they're behind the eight ball in this, and I don't know how they're going to how they're going to get ahead of this and get better. And inflation has decimated them. The future growth prospects are limited, and mortgage rates, despite they're going to likely tank in the next couple of years, they're still higher than where they were at the start of the pandemic, which exacerbated the situation. And you mentioned that about mortgage rates, and you look at the current mortgage rate, it's still around 6%. But of course, these market route, they're pricing in lower yields, which could eventually lead to lower mortgage rates.
Yeah, it's an odd market, isn't it? Because nobody's getting rid of their existing homes because it's just not financially worth it. And you mentioned that there aren't enough new build homes coming in either. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll mention that. That's what's funny, because in economics, in theory, you would say that, okay, if there's a crash in sales activity, then that must mean there's going to be an equilibrium and prices are going to fall. But that's not happening. Sure. But that leads to the second point. Yes, there has been years of underbuilding. When it comes to active listings in the property market, that's still way below where it was before the pandemic, or below the global financial crisis. And new housing starts has not recovered. It's been on a downward trend since I think March or April 2022, and it once again has not recovered from where it was before the Great Recession. So it's the current government has been trying to facilitate greater building through tax credits and grants. But as I said in my article, I mean, if government spending were the panacea to all our ails, homelessness would have been resolved many decades ago.
Yes. Well, we're all about solutions here on Liberty Nation Radio, and rather than just heralding in the doom and the gloom, let's talk about what actual. So we've only got just a minute left. I'd really like to get some base level solutions here. Now, Andrew, you're a free market libertarian. I'd say that's fairly accurate. Who's got a good head on his shoulder regarding economics. Doesn't it make sense to have a bonfire of the vanity regulations imposed at local, state, and federal level to encourage a mass building of houses? And if you had that, wouldn't that just fix everything?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Get rid of
Mark Angelides for the Nobel Prize.
You get rid of those egregious zoning laws, all these restrictions, these high taxes. Up here in Toronto, we had egregious zoning laws. We had rent controls. The provincial government came in and eradicated those rent controls for bills after 2018. And guess what? You had a huge boon of construction, and now rent prices are starting to gradually come down. So you see the market-based realities of what occurs when you get rid of all of these, massive big government programs or tools.
Liberty in everything always seems to be the answer. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today we are very fortunate to be joined by Mr. Dave Patterson, the man who knows everything there is to know about national security and the like. And he's here to educate me, hopefully, on what's happening with, well, I guess what we'd call it a Middle East tinderbox, wouldn't we, Dave?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it is. And incidentally, happy to be on your show. Nice build up.
Great to have you here.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I think that we're looking at here is the potential for precisely what the Biden administration has railed against, which is an escalation of the violence and the hostilities, and yet they won't deal with the single biggest problem, and that's Iran.
Well, let's talk about that. So you did a fascinating piece on the pages of LibertyNation.com recently, where you discussed that Iran's issue seems to be that it's coming to a realization that it can't actually take on Israel in a direct conflict, as has been demonstrated by they sent 300 missiles and Israel sent one back and hit their target. And is that kind of giving them pause in terms of making direct or overt threats, and instead convincing them to ramp up the proxy fighters that surround Iran?
I think that what Iran can do is to motivate.
Let's not give them advice, right? Let's not.
Yeah,
give
right.
Them...
well, but in terms of their capability, but they will motivate Hezbollah which has, as they say, 150,000 rockets, which is not nothing, as Donald Rumsfeld used to say. And of course, imagine that you have a coordinated Hezbollah, fanatical Palestinian West Bank, and the Hamas, what there is left of it, all coordinated in attacking Israel. Now, that would be, I think, a challenge for Israel, but not one that's insurmountable. I mean, they've shown that they're quite capable and adroit at taking on real military challenges. But what my point is that sending 300 ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles clearly is they're not capable of making any sort of a significant impact. And it's primarily because, contrary to what people might think, I mean, their technology is just not that great. Their coordination, all of the kinds of the command and control, all those kinds of things that actually make for a successful attack, they're not very good at. But at the same time, you have to say what they cause is a great deal of uncertainty, and they're just a challenging problem. And the United States is not doing the right things in terms of challenging that. Giving them as well, giving them back as good as we get. And there's this notion in the United States about proportionality, this concept of we do to you what you did to us. In other words, you send a rocket or a missile or a drone, or pick your favorite, and you strike us, we strike you with a drone and destroy a launch site. And you're seeing this play out in Yemen.
Yeah.
That is not what Clausewitz had in mind for proportionality.
Would you like to expand on that? What did he have in mind, do you think, then? Was it,
Sure,
you do this,
sure,
and then we
I just
destroy
threw that out
everything
as a
that
kind
you
of a
own?
teaser. Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, here's the point. You do mission for mission if you want proportionality. The Houthis, the terrorist Houthis in Yemen, their mission is to disrupt and stop commercial traffic in the Red Sea. That's what they're doing. We, on the other hand, are hitting them missile for missile. Well, our mission should be, if you're going to take a proportional point of view, our mission should be stopping the attacks totally. Now, Israel did a nice job of destroying the port in Sana'a. And what we should do is, our mission should be stop the attacks. And the way you do that is you have a massive airborne attack, missiles, drones, aircraft dropping 2,000-pounders, and you eliminate headquarters, boats, ports, everything that could be used in an attack.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, because I'm not au fait with the current military jargon and terminology, but isn't that what we laymen might call an escalation?
No, it's called a mission for mission proportionality. You're destroying their capability to harass you. That's what you want to do. You don't want to irritate them. That's what we're doing. We're irritating them. And that to no avail, obviously, because the attacks continue. We're not persuasive.
So it seems to me then that the United States currently has a posture of, we want to be seen to be retaliating, but without actually affecting the outcome in any meaningful way. It's almost as though, and this thought occurs to me, it's the old sci-fi books and movies where a time traveler goes back in time, but they're not allowed to actually affect anything, because such effect, breaking a twig in a forest or treading on a butterfly, if you will have serious repercussions out into the future. And that seems to me to be the State Department policy at the moment, is to act like time travelers, whereby they're merely witnessing and not trying to impact the final outcome. Is that a poor analogy?
No, I think it's fairly apt. I mean, first of all, that sort of thinking comes from, diplomatic fecklessness and cowardice. They think that all things can be solved in cocktail parties and where people come with a common goal and they sit down and they talk and they iron out their differences. That's totally ineffective because we're not dealing with a philosophy or a ideology that is something that is common to both of us, both the West and the East. It's just not. We're not dealing in the same realm, and by virtue of the fact of us not taking them on the way they would take us on, it puts us at a disadvantage. Reagan figured it out, and when we were having trouble in the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz, and the Iranians mined the Gulf of Hormuz, and one of our ships was seriously damaged. Reagan sunk their navy. They had half a navy the next day. That's what you have to do. It's just not. I don't understand why it is that, first of all, Iranian has submarines. They should all be at the bottom of the Gulf. This is ridiculous. And because once you influence and you convince the mullahs that whatever their goal was, it will never be achieved, because we can put everything that you have in terms of a military out of action, never to be seen again, by the way.
I think it's quite interesting that this piecemeal response, which may or may not be the right way to do it, but it does achieve one certain thing. It gives those that are operating against the US in many cases, and US allies in more cases, it gives them the idea that, look how long we can wage this war against the US and US allies. We must be doing something right. And that gives them a certain level of encouragement, confidence, and bravado that they wouldn't have under the, as you say, the proportionality response of, for example, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think imagine this: the United States for years was the preeminent marketing and advertising nation. We invented advertising and marketing, and we can't put messaging out that is successful to blunt the enemies. This is ridiculous, but we just don't have the will to do it. And to your point, all of this is not lost on the unaligned nations and those that would tend to roll in behind China and Iran, North Korea, and Russia. All of this stuff is not lost on them. And we're just out there flailing around. And we've now put a new, the Abraham Lincoln is going to be in that, along with an additional fighter squadron. And we already have the USS Wasp, which is an amphibious assault ship with the 24th Marines embarked. We have those there, but what are they there for? They're just defensive shoot down missiles. And okay, they shoot off missiles, we shoot them down. There is no end game. There's nothing achieved.
What we need then is Don Draper of Mad Men to come up with a coherent message for everybody. Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you always.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank our guests today, and of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in and join us each and every week. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.